The next strategy we're going to be talking about is gestures, which is personally one of my favorites. And the reason why it's one of my favorites is because it is so great at making language more understandable, especially for children who have low language. So right here, I'm going to move my camera because it's blocking the words for me, but I don't know what you guys can see. So as we said earlier with sound play, this is a great one for a warm-up, nonverbal children, children that don't speak the same language as you, and getting interest and trust. Because if you're just kind of pointing at something, you're going to get their attention. If it's a shy child, you're not even talking to them if you're just using gestures. So it can kind of be a little bit more easing, especially if they have anxiety. But my favorite way to use gestures is to pair it with language so that you can make complicated ideas more clear, and you can also increase utterance length. So if a child is saying, milk, milk, and they're pointing, they are likely trying to say, like, I want more milk, or maybe they're saying, milk, I don't want milk. And so even though the child's only verbally saying 1 or 2 words per utterance, these gestures, especially in young children about 2 years old, can really help build their utterance length, and then they can use the gestures to pair with language to make utterances even longer as they get older. And it can also help the child understand that you're expecting something from them. So if when you're asking a question, you always go like this, then the children are going to understand that when you go like this, you want them to answer, and it's just a great cue for them. It can also be helpful to point at a wall, at instructions, or to hold something out in front of them and just wait. And your facial expressions and your body language are your most powerful tool when you're trying to get children to be interested in what you're saying and understand what you're saying, right? Because you can slow it down and use gestures to help emphasize what you want them to understand. So when should you use gestures? Personally, I think all of the time, as much of the time as you can, because it does make language so much more salient, which means understandable and tangible, right? Because if you're just talking and using words they've never heard before, they don't have a definition for, they can't pair it with anything in their head, then using a gesture like, oh, like I was calling my friend the other day on my phone, then they know, like, oh, like I've seen my mom's phone before. She holds it up to her ear like this, and now they understand calling is what you use, the action paired with a phone. A side note, kind of random, I read somewhere that children no longer are using this symbol for calling. They're using this or this because they're used to holding the phone just up to their ear. Isn't that crazy? Another time when to use gestures is when the child has low language, or you want to make an idea clear, or to increase engagement, as I said on the last slide. So how to use gestures? I think a lot of people, especially if they don't use it naturally, like I talk with my hands a lot, as I'm sure you'll notice throughout these videos. And if you don't naturally just use gestures, it can be awkward to know, like, what am I doing? Or you might be doing really tiny gestures like, oh, what do you want? But for kids, to make them most engaged and to pay attention to what you're doing to get their attention, you're going to want to go big, like, what is going on? Like, oh my goodness. And just be big and pinpoint what you're trying to say. So if you're reading a story and talking about how a character is sleeping, you could just say, oh, the character went to sleep. Or you could say, oh, the character went to sleep. Shh, shh, right? So you want to pinpoint first, what am I trying to say? What do I want the child to understand? What is unclear about what I'm saying? And then, what gesture can I use to make this sentence most clear? Right? So this gesture might not be the best. This might be better. Adding in a sound might be even better. If you're trying to have an emotion, you can point to your face and be happy or sad or angry. So just think about what the child will already understand, what they're not going to understand, and how you can use a gesture to bridge those two things. It's also really helpful to pair gestures with other language facilitation strategies or reading strategies because they make language so much more salient, understandable for the child. And then encourage the children to also use gestures. So as you're using gestures, they're going to start catching on to that. And especially children with low language, they can use those gestures to help themselves be more understandable to you and to other children. And by increasing their intelligibility, they're going to have better behavior because they're not as angry and frustrated that people don't understand what they're saying. They're going to be clear about what they need and what they want, which is so important for children. And it's also going to help their self-advocacy because, say, a friend pushes them down, they can't go to the teacher and say, hey, my friend pushed me down, but they can go to the teacher and be like, sad, and then point to their friend, and then maybe even gesture like push, right? Or maybe they know their friend's name and they're crying and they say, oh, Aaron, right? And so then the teachers or you are going to understand what happened and they can step into that situation versus a child just sitting in the corner crying because they don't have the language to explain what happened. So again, with cooking, examples of gestures that you can use is to stir. And while you're doing this, you can be explaining like, oh, I'm gonna put a apple in my soup. What? Apples don't go in soup. Let's put a carrot in instead and let's stir the pot, right? So you're showing so much language with just your body. You're showing the pot itself, stirring, you're showing putting in, right? And especially if you have like actual fruits or vegetables at the kitchen set, then they can see that apple, they probably know that word, goes in, right? And so then they're going to start pairing this gesture with in, and then they can start using that gesture when they need to. As I mentioned before, you can use gestures to ask questions like, what should we put in our pie? How many apples? 1, 2, 3 apples all in our pie, right? So you're giving an example of a gesture for how many, showing that you're asking a question. Remember to use your facial expressions. You could say, oh, I wanted a big pizza for dinner, or I'm really full. I just wanted a little pizza for dinner, right? And so then you can show exactly what you're trying to say, and it emphasizes it. It makes it way clearer for the child. It allows them to start using gestures and to start pairing gestures with language, which in turn will create more language as they start speaking more. So gestures are absolutely, I'm sure you can tell, and I've said already, my favorite language facilitation strategy. And I use them all the time, even in adult life.